Real people, real stories, and real challenges that break the status quo. I'm your host, Zivile, and welcome to Perception Paradox. Jessica, welcome back to Perception Paradox. I'm so glad to see you again here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I know it's not been a while, but it's nice to see you again. We're going to talk all things storytelling, crisis. We're going to tell some juicy stories today.
Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Perception Paradox. We have back on the show Jessica Gioglio. I'm so glad to have her. And if you missed our first episode with her, you should go back and learn more about her. Right now, I guess what's important for this episode also to highlight that Jessica is a distinguished marketing innovator and author of renowned for her expertise in brand storytelling. And we've met many years ago, and obviously storytelling was always one of the things that would be a synonym and something that would kind of identify with Jessica. And yeah, because she has extensive experience with that and leading digital marketing, public relations initiatives for insane global brands such as Nokia, Dunkin' Donuts, TripAdvisors, and she has co-authored books like The Power of Visual Storytelling and The Loss of Brand Storytelling. And yeah, and she knows how to navigate high-stake situations, conversations, ranging from success stories to failures and failed product launches. So I'm very glad to have her back on Perception Paradox, because we agreed that we did not have time to touch base on crisis communication, and we find that it's quite crucial, and especially in nowadays uncertain world and anytime soon. So yeah, Jessica, I'm so glad to have you back. And we've just covered that storytelling is not one-sided. Usually when it comes to branding and storytelling, we think about the shiny things that, oh, how they tell my story, how they build it, how they make it shine. But it can be used for the opposite also, for communication when it comes to not so juicy things, to maybe to more juicy things, and when it's not that positive, right?
Yes, that's true. So I think one of the things that I'm proudest of in my career is I actually started in public relations, which when you work in public relations for a company, you are like the inbound of everything a journalist wants to ask about the company, right? And a lot of times, you just want like the good inquiries to come in, but then sometimes there's like a negative story, or even worse, something bad happens to your company. And then what do you do about it? And it was that at like that time in my career working where I learned the valuable lesson that you can actually, depending on the situation, you can tell a story in good times, but also in bad times. And the reasons why storytelling works in good times is because, it builds deeper emotional connections. It helps us kind of understand each other better. Those are the same reasons why it works in a crisis or negative situation, because when something bad happens to you as a company, you want to, within reason, explain to your customers, to your investors, to people who follow you in the news media, what happened, why it happened, how you're fixing the problem. And a story can be a great way to do that.
And how can we do it actually then? Crisis in the negative setting.
Yeah, so typically let's frame up a little bit like what a brand crisis is. I like to explain it really simply. So a brand crisis typically, when we start to frame it, and then we can go into maybe some examples of what that looks like. So a brand crisis is typically either something you create as a business or something that happens to you. So more specifically, I would say like crises that you create might be like a marketing campaign gone wrong. Like someone tweeted something they shouldn't on social media. It could also be like your product doesn't work the way it says it does, or perhaps you have like a product outage. So there was one really interesting one that happened, I think it was in November of last year. So a Zipcar, who many of us have probably heard of, you can rent cars through an app. It's a subscription service. Now, Zipcar actually had an outage, and people were like renting these Zipcars, and it stranded them in random places. And all of a sudden, all these stories started popping up on social media with like customers literally having meltdowns because the product wasn't working. And it was literally a global outage that happened. and people missed flights. They couldn't get to their universities to do tests on time. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, like on a hike. They couldn't get back into the car. So those are examples of crises you create, whether it's, it might be an accident that you had an outage, but that happens. Now, another example is crises that happen to you. So this could be things like cyber attacks, data breaches. We see a lot of this happening where hackers come and you have to go into damage control. Or what about in Los Angeles recently, we saw the wildfires, literally seemingly overnight. Companies, individuals completely had to change how they had to evacuate on no notice. Some people lost everything, even some businesses lost everything. So then these were crises that happened, where companies then had to decide, okay, what's our policy with our employees? How do we treat them while they're going through this? If the office burned down or they couldn't provide services, they had to figure out, oh, did I freeze? Yeah. Let me know where I should pick back up. Maybe at the question, we could start the question over.
I'm like, let me see if it's recorded. It's such a good flow, and the universe is messing with us.
I'm ready to rock. So
okay, let's continue. I think I'm just gonna see.
Do you want to start the question again?
I'm like thinking, what was the question I even asked about different crisis types? No, you pulled it in.
Yeah, I think we were saying like something around like, when can you tell your story in a crisis? And I was like, well, why don't we start with like what some of the crisis types are, and then we can go into when you should tell your story.
Okay, so let's start from there, and then I will see in case I will record the beginning. But I hope it's saved out. I don't know what happened. It's again first time on Riverside. Yay! Anyway, okay. So when it comes to crisis communication, right, what are the type of crisis companies are facing usually, and when do you really start to react, or when do you know that you are in crisis as a company?
Yeah, okay. So let's start. Actually, I'll do a more formal, almost corporate-ish definition of a brand crisis. So essentially, a brand crisis is any unexpected event or situation that threatens a company's reputation, your customer trust, or even business operations. But typically, how I like to define it is in a very simple way. Crises are either crises you create or crises that happen to you. So let's share a few examples there. Crises you create might be like a marketing campaign gone wrong. Like you work so hard on this marketing campaign, you put it out into the universe, and it's not well received. A good example of that is Pepsi with the Black Lives Matter movement with Kendall Jenner. That really was a fail for Pepsi. It also could be, your product or service doesn't work the way it should. For example, Sonos, I think recently just redid their app, and customers were just saying it's really buggy, it doesn't work. It's been a huge failure for the brand, and actually probably too nuanced for me to go into in depth in the podcast. But if you're interested, Google it, because it's all unfolding in real time, where like high profile people are leaving the company. There's all this data about how much sales they've lost and kind of what the impact's been, just because, and like an update to the app didn't work. Or what about when maybe for B2B or B2C, you have like a total service outage? So an example of this came from Black Friday last year in November, where Zipcar had a global outage, and things happened where customers were like stranded in the middle of nowhere after a hike. People missed flights, their flight at the airport because they couldn't get into the car. People said they missed exams at university. People were having meltdowns online because they couldn't get a hold of Zipcar quickly enough to resolve the issue. So pretty bad. But then what about crises that happen to you? Well, this can be something like a cyber hack or a data breach. It can be also something like a natural disaster or a terrorist attack. So an example here is the recent LA fires. So people lost their homes, businesses were destroyed. And then some companies also just rose to the occasion, like Airbnb, to offer free emergency housing to people impacted. But there were so many layers to this, because as a company, if you had an office in LA, how do you kind of manage your employees and what they're going through? If you've lost your business, how do you manage that? So quite a few layers on that one. And then another one that I think is also kind of random, kind of funny, but kind of scary is TikTok, for example. Sometimes these viral trends happen on TikTok or social media. And one that happened was there was a cooking challenge where it's a medicine in the US called NyQuil. And It's basically if you have the cold or the flu, it helps you sleep at night. And it's like this, electric blue kind of liquid. And people were doing this like cooking challenge with chicken and NyQuil. And the whole idea is that if you try to cook a medicine on high heat, it's going to change the composition of it and be potentially fatal or dangerous to you. So that put the company in crisis mode to basically say, do not do this at home. So those are some examples, but let me go through a few that we haven't discussed yet. So there also can be lawsuits or compliance issues, a leadership crisis, maybe there's a fight happening amongst the leadership and it becomes public. We see this a lot with startups, don't we? Maybe a funding crisis where you don't get that much needed round of funding or someone pulls funding. We saw a lot of this happening during the pandemic where businesses just failed because they didn't have enough runway, or like a supply chain issue meant they didn't have funding to continue. We also can talk about customer backlash. So an incident with a customer or a complaint goes completely viral. How do you manage that? Could be a supply chain or an operational issue. Could be something where a competitor comes after you or a competitor is completely overtaking your business with a new product. And then also there could be investor or board disputes as well. So those are the ones that I see that are the most common. And then let me pause here and see, where we should take this next.
Yeah, I think the immediate question for me is when it comes to this whole crisis, it's very sensitive to time. How quick do you react? And especially nowadays in social media, right? It can kill the brand, the company in no time, basically, with all this hate movement. So what's the role when it comes to crisis response into time and impact? How does it work? You have to, in most of the cases, immediately respond to some apology, or where do the company begin? Because of course, obviously, the audiences are different. I mean, one thing is to be locked out of the car, another thing to have a data breach. But there must be some kind of frameworks or steps. How do you react?
Yeah, so okay. So I think it's in our human nature to want to react immediately, but I would like to make a public service announcement here that you should not feel pressure to do that. I want to be empathetic and say I understand, because I've managed so many crises in my career, and like it hits you and it triggers this dopamine release and you're like, you just want to be like running on all cylinders to fix it and move on. But when a crisis hits, the first thing that you actually need to do is to really do an investigation of the situation. So, what's happened? We need to really make sure that we have all the facts, because if we speak too soon, we could say something we regret or we could spread misinformation. So we really want to do that. And depending on the size of your company, you're probably going to need to form a cross-functional task force of people who are going to help you investigate the crisis, but also start to, be the core voices on how you manage it and what you should say when you are ready to say something. So, really the examples of who you might bring on your cross-functional task force might be, the public relations team, the investor relations team, usually someone who's like the product owner, whether you're B2B or B2C, usually if it's product related. If it's customer related as well, you might want to bring the customer service team. For sure, your legal team should be involved. And then usually there should be some sort of C-suite sponsorship. Could also be operations as well. So you do want to bring those people in depending on the nuance of the crisis. So maybe we could use like the Zipcar product outage, for example. They would want to bring in, public relations, because the news media is asking us, hey, what's going on? People are going crazy on social media about this. You probably want to bring the social media lead in, because it's a lot of the impact is on social media and customer service as well. You want to bring in kind of the product experts, probably from a technical standpoint, to say, okay, what's the impact? how quickly can we get back online to fix this? You also probably want someone from operations to say, okay, what can we do in the interim? And I would say as well, legal and investor relations are always important, because if the crisis starts to hit the news media, then they're going to be facing, if you're a publicly traded company, this might have the potential to impact stock price if it becomes material, or if it's something that's going to get long and drawn out, which would mean it becomes material. And then also legal, if there could be potential for lawsuits there, would be kind of what I would think of that task force. And then what we would do as a task force is decide, okay, once we decide kind of our plan of action of how we can resolve this, that's when we start kind of crafting the messaging. Now, for public relations and customer care, we're probably going to look at something like a holding statement to start. So that kind of taps into our need of like, we want to say something immediately. Would be like, thank you for making us aware of this, or we might say, yes, we are aware. We have a global outage. We are working to we are working to resolve the situation as soon as possible. Something like that. That's what we call like a holding statement in the industry. And then, obviously we'll be able to follow up when we have a more concrete plan on what we can do. And that's where you could then give customer care kind of some additional, like if customers ask X, Y, and Z messaging, that you could use for social media and customer care, where if the customer says, well, can I just abandon the car? You would say yes. Am I going to get charged for this? You would say probably no. And there might be some things like tactical that you can agree on, but the most important point is that you want the messaging to be consistent across all of those customer facing touch points. And then you want to decide, okay, are we going to put out a proactive statement, or are we just going to be reactive? So proactive would be like, maybe you put something on your website, or you put something on social media or email. Now, the danger of doing this is you raise awareness for the crisis for people who had no idea what was going on. So I tend not to recommend that unless there's like a public safety issue at hand. So an example of that is when we were at Dunkin', this was the era where like free gift card scams were running rampant on Facebook. And Facebook was really slow to squash them. And it almost felt like a game of whack-a-mole. Like we would get one taken down and like another would pop up. So, and we ran a lot of contests on like enter for a chance to win a free gift card. But then there were these links that were saying like, get a free $50 gift card to Dunkin'. And we're like, oh gosh, they're literally trying to manipulate what we're doing to scam people and put malware on their phone or computer. So that was the case where we did put out public statements on our website and on our email, and really educating people how to know if something is real or fake that they're seeing online. So that would be an example of when to do it. But then usually in most cases, you just want to focus on the reactive channels, the customers that are reaching out, as well as the news media and investors and whatnot.
Okay, so what I'm hearing as well, the common mistakes are that we are reacting too soon before the investigation is done. Why did this crisis happen? And that it seems also that the team is not aligned on the crisis response, right? What to communicate, what will happen, what's happening. And yeah, when it comes to data breaches, so I find it very complicated cases overall in general, because then the law part is also involved into that, and that's just wild. Do you see any other common mistakes when it comes to crisis communication messages? For example, when the companies do a mistake, and let's go to B2C, and when you create your crisis case, that I don't know, you are producing some kind of accessory, you're selling it on massive scale, but you have huge delays with delivery, and before they reach your customer, you're already launching a new line. And then what the company could do in this case, that they do not meet the supply, demand, and the orders requirement, but then they already made the mistake that they launched another campaign, and customers that order from previous batch are not happy. What would you do as a PR expert?
So what I would say is like you almost come on. It's tough because what I would imagine is happening internally there is like the business has taken a sales hit and they want to make up for it. So they're like, let's do a new campaign. Let's try and sell some more and recoup this. So okay, let's pause, because I think like when we think about telling your story in a crisis, the reasons why you want to do it is you want to kind of protect trust and credibility of your business. You want to demonstrate your brand values and resilience, because a crisis essentially can test what your company stands for. And you also want to shift from essentially crisis to that recovery and rebuilding. So in the situation that you highlighted, if things weren't working, we're getting lots of complaints, people aren't happy, and we're just going to keep marketing and just like pretend that we didn't hear it. What happens there is you come off like you're a business that isn't listening to your customers, and you come off a bit tone deaf, right? So what I would think of there, like anytime there's negative feedback, you want to show customers that you're listening and learning from it. And I actually think one of the more remarkable stories that you could tell is actually saying, hey, say your Sonos and your product, your app relaunch didn't go well. You could say, hey, you could acknowledge the mistake and say, hey, we messed up. We're really sorry. We shipped a product that didn't work and didn't meet customer expectations. And we've spent the past X amount of time just listening and talking to some of our most passionate customers. And here's what we've done to fix the product as a result of it. Because that way you're showing humbleness and humility. You're building trust, right? And then you're showing them how you're rebuilding, and you're showing them, if you're a brand that you're in subscription, that's going to be like, great, let me hold on for the next update because they said they're going to make it right. Right? Mm-hmm. Especially for your most loyal customers, they're going to do it. But in the case you said, if they just keep like remarketing and not listening, I think they're going to hit an inflection point where they realize they can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And if, a lot of what companies say, you're like whether you're B2B or B2C, you're measuring kind of the sentiment of your marketing campaigns. So if all of a sudden the sentiment shifts from being very positive and excited about the new product or service offering to like, hey, you didn't even, this product is terrible, it doesn't work. Like I've complained so many times, and like, why are you launching something else? Or you're not listening. That's going to kind of overcrowd and undermine that campaign you did, and it's going to detract other customers from purchasing. And like another way to think about it is when we make purchase decisions, we usually consult one or more touch points. So like say you're buying something on Amazon for the first time, you're probably looking at some of the reviews there, but you might also have discovered it from like an Instagram post. So you're looking at some of the comments there. And if everything is overwhelmingly negative, you're just not going to buy the product in the first place.
100%. From all those common cases you've just mentioned and crises, right? Do you have some kind of interesting stories to share that, I don't know, they flipped the story and had a positive turnaround? I'm pretty curious about how the car company, the Zipcar, did, because I did not hear about their exact case. But if I would have been in the shoes of a customer who is just going for a kite surfing session and gets locked out because the car with all the warm clothes are there, I was like, oh, I would kill.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what I would say is Zipcar's response was very basic and corporate. And this one, they were very much in damage control mode. I would have loved for them to tell a bit more of a story around what happened and, show how they were like, if someone was really inconvenienced, did they do something above and beyond for that person? I think would have been quite interesting. I think one of the best examples of crisis management that I think your listeners will enjoy is, okay, in the UK and Ireland, I'm not kidding with this, KFC actually ran out of chicken. So can you imagine if you're a fast food restaurant that is just known for chicken, and then all of a sudden you just run out? Like that's pretty big as far as brand crises go. And what was pretty funny with this one is when they started closing some of the restaurants for this, social media, like you cannot hide anything from social media. People started posting about it, and they were being like tweets like, so KFC have run out of chicken. This is how the apocalypse starts. Like really funny. And like that kind of stuff just goes viral so quickly. And to make matters worse, some customers even called the police about it in the UK. And it prompted the Met Police to tweet, if you're outraged by your fast food restaurant running out of chicken, this is not a reason to call 999. Like, this is not an emergency.
Oh,
like, you're preventing other people in danger from getting through to us. So, okay, so let's map out how bad it was. Let's map out the numbers. So the story reached about 80% of UK adults. 750 restaurants actually closed. 1,000 staff were impacted. So this is pretty big as
Yeah.
far as brand crisis went. And what I loved about this is because it was such a high impact crisis, they didn't shy away from it. They honestly told their story throughout. So they used social media to update their customers in real time about what was happening. So let's actually pause and say, well, what did happen, right? Like, you don't just run out of chicken overnight without like something happening in your
Mhm.
business. So it actually was a supply chain issue. And what happened is they were switching suppliers. And what they had said is the supplier was having teething problems. So they started putting out these posts on social media using like, have you heard of the joke where like the chicken crossed the road? So they put out posts saying the chicken crossed the road, just not to our restaurants. And they explained, and they used like these text visuals on social media. And they said, like, we brought on a new partner. They're having some teething problems. And they said specifically getting chicken out to 900 restaurants across the country is pretty complex, but they won't compromise on quality. So again, like reinforcing the values in a crisis, right? So this means some restaurants have had to close. Some are operating on a limited menu or short in hours. And they also gave a shout out to their teams who were working to get them back up and running and working really hard. So I thought like these real-time posts were really good in keeping customers educated. And then they also poked a bit of fun at themselves. So I don't know who came up with this, but I think the person who did deserves a raise because if you think about the letters KFC and you thought about swirling them around a bit, what do they spell? I'm going to tell you. It's FCK, short for a curse word. So what they did is they took a visual of an empty bucket of chicken and they took out a full page ad in all of the top newspapers in the UK with an apology note that also explained the story of what happened and how they were resolving it.
Mm.
So really genius, right? And I think, you know, when you think about it from a customer perspective, people were outraged, they were making fun of them. But you know what, also, like when you think about our psychology as humans, what do we want the most? We want the thing we can't have, right? So by actually telling their story with how they were resolving this issue, they were actually sparking cravings for KFC as well. So when they finally did reopen, they did really well, like way above average from a sales perspective because they were human, they told their story. And I think to me, this is really what earns trust is owning up to it, when it makes sense. Not every crisis you can poke fun at yourself, but we have to think about the customer experience. And this is what drove a better customer experience longer term for them.
Oh, that's such a cool story and case, actually.
Yeah.
Well done on their side. Thanks for sharing. When it comes to crisis communication, then, right, we do have this saying, I'm not sure if you have it also in the US, that prepare your skis in summer or like get ready in shape for summer in winter. So basically, can we actually prepare as a company, brands for potential crises before they occur? And if yes, so what would be the proactive measures everybody can take?
Yeah. So, okay, my best advice is remember when I talked to you about that cross-functional team that we had at
Hmm.
I didn't really get to talk a lot about Duncan, but at Duncan, we actually did crisis management training. We actually we would train with a cross-functional team on various scenarios and how we respond to it. We also had like a library of like every possible crisis for the business. So I think one thing you can do, and I actually do workshops on this with companies, is we can actually go through and based on your business, map out every possible crisis that could be a threat. And then we could start to brainstorm with that cross-functional team how we would approach the investigation and how we would approach the management of it, down to making possible holding statements as well as a framework for what a statement could look like. A lot of businesses like now we can predict a lot more. So let's use Dunkin' Donuts as an
Hmm.
example. And sorry, we're talking a lot about food, so I hope we're not making people hungry. But say you're a fast food business, with fast food, you could think about things like, okay, there could be like foreign objects in the food, right? Like you get your cup of coffee and there's like some hair in it or something gross like that. Like, ew, no one wants that, right? Maybe not a brand crisis. So like a lot of like what we did at Dunkin' was frame out like what are the different levels of it? And we would use kind of like a stoplight system where like what's an incident versus like, green, it's like a bit of an incident, but like probably going to be mostly business as usual. What's yellow where maybe we need to slow down, and how are we going to, so like on that spectrum, like, a bit of mold on a bagel or something like that is probably more a green, unless maybe it becomes a yellow where all of a sudden we're seeing all the bagels,
Mm.
are moldy, and then maybe there's a supply chain problem. Whereas red would be, we need to do a product recall. Like the bagels are not safe to eat. They're making people sick. People are going to the hospital. That's how we'd frame out like the levels of this. And then we think about from business operations, external and customer communications, how we would resolve this.
Okay.
Yeah, it's quite a fun exercise. And it's great when you get people from different walks of the business. Like they will come up with like lots of ideas. And then when I actually feel like, remember how we talked about earlier in the interview, how we said it's in our human nature to just want to react and
Yeah.
like, and that's actually the most dangerous thing to do, because that's when we get ourselves in hot water. And I have a funny one I can tell you about as well with that one once
Go
I
for it. Yeah.
finish. But yeah, if you actually start to get this team thinking about this and like okay, when the scary scenario comes, it's still scary, but it's a little bit less so, and it doesn't kind of trigger that. You're like, okay, we know how we need to manage this. Here's the process and the steps. We've actually done some work mapping out, like, does this apply to the scenario that actually happened? And then we work together as a team to navigate it. Because the scenario I was going to tell you is sometimes, like with lawsuits, you just can't say anything. But we had someone actually try and sue us at Dunkin' for making their coffee too sugary, saying they were a diabetic and it sent them into diabetic shock. And somewhat because Dunkin' is franchised, they called the franchisee's office first, and his secretary was like, we always make, like, the direct quote was like, we always make coffee exactly as the customer orders it. Like, we sell donuts, not crystal balls. And like, you can just imagine what took like something that would maybe be like, a yellow, and it took it to a red,
Yeah.
because that just went completely viral, and like all the late night TV hosts just started like using that, like, was such a good one liner. And it's tough because in that situation as a business, we did a lot of scenario planning with lawsuits, but the issue with lawsuits is that anything you say publicly is discoverable. So you also want to be really careful specifically with lawsuits, and really involve your legal team, because emails can be discoverable. So how you actually manage those kind of crises that involve lawsuits or like class action lawsuits, you have to be really careful as a business. So this is where this cross-functional team comes in. But yes, reacting too soon, not always good.
Love it. So we covered quite a lot of now examples. Also, what happens when also the crisis happens to you because of your fault. But what about, I don't know, something that you cannot control, and from the breaches and the crisis that actually happens for you, how different it is that we approach it? Because it's something you cannot really foresee. You can foresee in a way, but sometimes not really. A lot of environmental factors can affect.
Yeah, let's maybe use like a data breach, and then let's use maybe like a natural disaster or terrorist attack one. So on the data breach side, there are things from like a legal and compliance standpoint that you will have to do in those kind of situations. And you really have to look at the laws of, like, if it's in the US, like the state that it's happening in or the country that it's happening in, to make sure you're compliant. But usually, as a general rule of thumb, you need to notify customers if their data is impacted, right? So this is where you're going to need to put out public messages, probably over email, on your website, etc. So that's going to be like, there's going to be a compliance angle with, you're going to educate people about, okay, what data was impacted, and what they can do to resolve it. If they need to do anything like change their passwords or, make sure if it's like in the US, it's social security number. You might want to sign up with some of the credit bureaus to, put a watch on your account just to make sure you're okay. So those are things that, you would need like tactically. But then I would look at, okay, well, how did it happen? And then I would want to tell the story of how we are fixing our systems to make sure it doesn't happen again so we can keep that customer trust. Yep. And then for a natural disaster or terrorist attack, I think one example I have personally is I was at the Boston Marathon bombing. I actually had just been on the finish line area, like kind of diagonally across from where the second bomb went off. And there were basically two bombs went off at the Boston Marathon. It was like more homegrown terrorism. And we had a coffee truck that was diagonally across from where the second bomb went off. And I had just gone home to take a conference call. And you get home and I heard pop, pop and saw smoke rising above the buildings because I lived very close to that area at the time. And my neighbor somehow got through before all the cell phone service went out and told me what happened. And then my first thought is, oh my God, like our team, like, are they okay? You don't know. So we had to, it was good that we had done all this training, and we had even done training on those scenarios because we had to immediately get a crisis team together to look at, okay, we had this sampling truck that was handing out coffee samples. Is everyone okay? We also had a restaurant that was in between the two bombs on the same side of the street. All the windows got blown out. Is everyone okay? Flying glass, thankfully, like knock on, I don't know how, but everyone that was running the marathon, they're watching it that we knew of, everyone was okay, which was like unbelievably lucky. But then we went into, okay, so once we did the assessment, we thought, well, we are a brand that's really well known with Boston. So what else should we do in this situation? And there were immediately kind of like the day after, there were starting to be vigils for the victims because some people died, people lost limbs, all the things that you would expect when a bomb goes off. People's lives were changed forever. And we thought, well, hey, the bare minimum we can do at the vigils is provide food and warm beverages, right? So our franchisees immediately rallied, said we want to just provide as much free food and beverages for all the vigils that we can. And there was a fund being started for the victims. So through our community foundation, we immediately donated $100,000 to it. But then we also did more fundraising in our stores where customers who didn't really know how to donate could just put like cash and change into the donation boxes. So we, for probably, a long period of time after we did that. And I think, these are important things to do. It's obviously looking at the crisis impact of, okay, you have to look at it under the lens of your business, but you also want to look at it under the lens of the community. And what we did specifically on social media, which I think is good advice as well, we also tweeted as soon as it happened, once we had done our investigation, we tweeted a heartfelt message of support. And I'll actually read it for you because I think it's always just nice to have examples of copy that you use in these situations. We tweeted, our thoughts are with the victims and everyone affected by the explosions at the Boston Marathon. We grieve with all of Boston and the community. And what we did after that is we stopped posting on social media. So we actually stopped posting for an entire week. And I think one other mistake, especially when it's like a natural disaster or a terrorist attack that companies make, is we live in a society with marketing where we just like schedule everything, right? Like we have posts scheduled for days or weeks ahead of time. So where a lot of brands get themselves in hot water is something bad happens and you've done the set it and forget it with your organic posts and also your ad campaigns, right? And all of a sudden, like this ad that you had in the context of that crisis or natural disaster really doesn't look good, right? So what I always recommend is take a pause everything organic and paid while kind of the situation, like it's almost like you want to create space on social media for people who want to come together and talk about what happened, to grieve, to share stories of people impacted. You don't want your post to be interrupting that. And the length of time is always going to vary. For us, it was 1 week because it was a really weird situation where they didn't catch the suspects for another week after the bombs went off. And we got caught, we had like a whole nother layer of crisis after that because there was a lockdown and there was some confusion about some of our restaurants open. So we had crisis mode part 2 of also correcting people where like there were memes running where like the city of Boston goes on lockdown, like while they're catching the suspects, and Dunkin' refuses to close. And that was not what happened. It was just the timing of the lockdown where like our stores sometimes open at like 5 or 6 in the morning, and they didn't call the lockdown until much later. So you then have to decide, do you shelter in place with the employees? Is it safe to send them home? And then we also had some that would like stay locked to serve first responders. So we also had to do a lot of real time kind of triage of that, where we were like I've never had an incident where NPR News is like live tweeting the locations of open Dunkins. I'm like,
good promo.
and we had to be really proactive on social media saying, do not violate the lockdown for a cup of coffee. Our stores are not open. This is not correct. So we also had like a second layer of that crisis where we had to correct the misconception, because what was happening, and I found myself on a call with the entire Dunkin' C-suite, and they're like, do we have to say anything? You know, usually we never kind of sent statements to the news media through Twitter before. We usually handled it through public relations channels. And I had said to them, I'm like, this is moving at such a fast pace. I think we have to be really proactive and just send tweets that say correction with the truth of what's happening. And we weighed the pros and cons of it. We looked at the messaging, and our chief communications officer made the call saying, I think this is the right approach. So then I had the daunting task of being on the front lines to do that, and also measuring the sentiment and the response in real time, because what I had shown them on the call was the sentiment is getting really negative. So it's also good in the crisis. Something I always recommend is, I always call it like the calm the F down index. Because you know how like we get stressed out when a crisis happens, but you want to look at the data and the numbers and start to build benchmarks as they happen to what really is a bad crisis. Because then when you talk about the numbers internally, you're like, well, this is only like a few hundred posts about this. This maybe is more yellow than red. But if it's, I couldn't keep up with the posts in real time on Twitter, and a lot of them were negative, saying like, how dare you put your employees in danger? But that wasn't what we were doing. So by being really proactive, we actually shifted the sentiment from very negative to very positive. And people understood. They said, Duncan, like, that makes sense. Like, of course, we knew there was something more to the story there. And and by showing the data, I was actually able to show that bell curve with the executives on, here's where we started and here's where we ended. And it was just a great story on, and again, going back to my earlier point, is usually for most companies, when I am in the trenches doing crisis management, we do a daily report. And what that daily report includes is number of press clippings, number of customer service inquiries, a number of social media posts, and like the sentiment. And you can drill down a bit with some of the keywords and whatnot. Then we also will look at, depending on the crisis, we'll look at kind of the operational management of it, whether it's like software failure or, supply chain and product, or, we're looking at how that team is managing getting that up and running. And we send a daily report to the whole cross-functional team and the C-suite. And that way, all of them are, especially for the C-suite, if they're getting calls from the board or investors directly, then they can say, hey, we started at this point, but here's actually, a few days in, we're just seeing it like more than 50% day over day, it's going down. And then they have the data to say, or when someone sees like a new kind of scary post online and goes to that C-suite executive, they can say, oh, on average, like with our crisis assessment system, it only kind of falls here because of the data we've collected on it. So it's actually a really good way as well to, in some cases, reduce your emotions and stress around it, but also maybe in other cases know like, hey, this is so urgent, we have to drop everything and we can only focus on this.
Oh, that's a very powerful case you've just shared. Thank you for taking time. And it brought me to the question now then, when do you think the company needs to have already internal communication pros and focus on actually building such plans? Because we start thinking about that only when things go wrong, right? But what would be this kind of preparation for the companies to start thinking about extending the communication department or start working with external agencies who could potentially help to oversee and be ready to jump in?
So what I always recommend is, communications teams tend to be understaffed and overworked.
Yeah.
It's usually, I started my career in public relations, and the reason why it was easy to get jobs in public relations is because they always it was, you hit a tipping point where it's easy to get either interns or like young junior hires because they just need help, right? There's just a lot gets dumped on them. Like anything with words pretty much gets dumped on the comms team. They're like, why am I writing your email copy? Like I shouldn't be doing this. So, okay. So what I would recommend is I always like to start with, just like we do our annual planning for proactive, I think we should do some annual planning around crisis management. We should dust off what we have. If we don't have anything, we don't have to do everything under the sun overnight. I would say let's start with maybe we start putting time in the calendar on whether a monthly or a quarterly basis to do like these workshop sessions and just say, a big goal of ours within the next 6 months or within the next 2 quarters is to have this plan done. Think about what would work within your company. If you're small and you're a startup, you're probably not going to have huge amount of resources or time to do it. So this is where maybe bringing an external consultant in for a whole day of workshops or 2 days of workshops, rip off the Band-Aid and get it done. If you're a bigger company, you probably already have some of this mapped out, and it's probably more about fine tuning. So if you carve out like half a day a month just to do these workshop sessions and get everyone engaged, I tend to recommend like blocks of time because then you get people engaged and focused, and you can give them pre-reads and ways to start thinking about it within their subject matter expertise going in. So I do think that's really good to do. And then the second piece that I recommend is it's always a good idea to have external consultants and agencies that you can call in a pinch. So audit who you currently work with is always a good place to start. Do they have skill set? Is where I would start. And if they don't, look at some crisis management firms that you could, take a call with them for an hour and just say, hey, we're screening firms in the case that something happens, and we just want to know, who we can call in a pinch. And you probably want to get a few of them in case some are at capacity when something hits. And then I think the third piece I would say is, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. The third piece I would say is maybe also bake in some time for doing some of those exercises, like those trial run exercises based on when you've done your threat assessment, do some of those. And then maybe it's not just about the leadership team, but you might want to bring some key people who sit below the head of or below the C-suite. And then you could give them the training that they could maybe do a separate training with their team. So if you're the social media team or the customer care team, you might want to just do, like, you as the leader of that team might just want to do a workshop just for them. But now you've gotten the training and the framework of it, which you can then just replicate with your team directly.
Okay, pretty practical. And so
it's all practical at the end of the day. It looks so scary, but if you just step by step, it actually is a lot more manageable than you think.
So what would be resources you recommend people to go to? I know that you are also running a newsletter and you share a lot of valuable tips and tools in your blog. Also, of course, your books are quite a good starting point, I would say, to get into this whole storytelling as a topic is set.
Yeah, so I have a newsletter that's on LinkedIn and my blog called The Marketer's Storybook. I am in the process of looking for an email client also to just do it via email. But if you subscribe to my blog to get every blog post, you can just get it that way for now. And then also you can find me LinkedIn, jessicagioglio.com is my website and blog. On social media as well, like Instagram, I share a couple case studies every day in my stories if you just want some short snackable things. And then what I would say as well, if you're really interested in crisis management specifically, there's a podcast I really like it's out of the UK. It's called When It Hits the Fan. It's a BBC podcast, and it's really great because it's two British gentlemen. One is the former editor-in-chief of a big newspaper in the UK that was a tabloid, so a bit more like saucy headlines and loves a crisis. And the other is a really fabulous career crisis communications PR expert who's also worked with the royal family in the UK. Wow. And what I love is it does have a bit of a bent on it, but they do cover global crises as well. And they break it down and they debate how they might manage it. So I think for me, it's a bit of brain food. I like hearing and thinking with my gut reaction, if they agree or disagree.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's pretty cool. Thanks for sharing. So we're going to leave all the links in the show notes. Also, our first episode that we recorded in Riga, so that listeners can actually get familiar with. And yeah, we're getting closer to the end. Any final thoughts, Jessica, or maybe a thought you want to leave the audience with to ponder on?
I always tell people to tell the stories that matter. And I think, when you look at a crisis, just really evaluate, is there something here that we can share that builds our reputation or builds or repairs our reputation, that kind of tells the story, that lets customers in, and just it humanizes the brand. Nobody is perfect all of the time. And sometimes when the bad things happen, it actually can build a lot of trust and goodwill if we handle it the right way and tell the story in the way that matters.
Couldn't imagine a better way to finish this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, it was Jessica Gioglio. We will leave all the links in the show notes. Connect, follow her, information about communication, and especially when it comes to crisis. And yeah, we hope you learned a lot. Well, I definitely did and got some good insights into interesting cases. And we wish you a great day wherever you are. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for having me.